Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm very delighted to have Alexander Betts today with us. I'm very honored actually to be introducing him. Alexander Betts is a professor of forced migration and international affairs at the University of Oxford. And he's also the director of the Refugee Center. And his most recent book is The Wealth of Refugees: How Displaced People Can Build Economies. Alexander's biography is really long, and he's done so much in his career, and he has a lot of publications and a lot of work, and I encourage everybody to go through some of his publications, if not all. So I'm really delighted to have you here, and I'm happy to hear from you on this conversation. Alex.
Thank you very much, Osama. It's a real pleasure to be able to join you for the conversation.
Thank you very much. For the sake of time, I will just go on with just to talk a bit about the refugee regime, and you are one of those in the world that actually very familiar with it. So the refugee regime is based on clear norms and international laws, of course, that the aim of it, or some of the aim of it, is to ensure protection for refugees and to respect their rights. But we always see that these are routinely violated in different countries, different contexts. If those principles of international refugee law are not respected, are not enforceable, what's the value of international refugee law?
So international institutions exist to create structured and predictable behavior between states. And the international refugee regime at its core is quite simple. It comprises the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees, which defines who is a refugee and the rights to which refugees are entitled, and the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, that has supervisory responsibility for states implementing the 1951 Convention and the obligations they've signed up for. Now, one of the challenges, of course, as you say, is that very often today, there is endemic non-compliance with the 1951 Convention. States that have signed up to and ratified that convention are not complying with its core obligations. Either they are engaging in what's called refoulement, forcing people back to countries where they face a well-founded fear of persecution, or they're not giving refugees access to their full set of rights in the convention, whether those are civil and political rights or socioeconomic rights, like the right to work and freedom of movement. And we see that in many countries around the world. My own country, the UK, has recently passed the Nationality and Borders Act, which has become known as the Anti-Refugee Bill, because it essentially makes it illegal to claim asylum in the UK unless you've got access to the visa you need to get into the country, which is almost impossible for most asylum seekers. It's also embarked on a deportation deal with Rwanda that's been criticized by UNHCR as being against international refugee law. You can move to Denmark, and it's a country that's aspiring to be quote unquote asylum free and has been deporting Syrian refugees back to Syria, for instance. We can look at Australia, a country that routinely sends asylum seekers to the island of Nauru and leaves them in indefinite detention in horrendous circumstances. We can look at the practices of the Trump administration in the US and see flagrant violations of international refugee law, from putting child asylum seekers in cages to sending people back to Mexico to await asylum determination decisions. Equally, in low and middle income regions of the world, we also see a challenge to compliance. We see Kenya threatening to close the Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camps. We see countries like Tanzania not providing refugees with the right to work or freedom of movement. So non-compliance with refugee law is everywhere in the world. It is increasingly endemic, and it is a massive challenge. And one of the problems, as you say, Osama, is that the refugee system was created without an enforcement mechanism. Unlike human rights treaties, the 1951 Convention doesn't have a treaty body. It doesn't have a body in Geneva that assesses whether states comply with refugee law or measures their compliance or holds them accountable for that. So the question is, what value does it have? Why do we value refugee law if states don't comply with it and if there's no real way to get them to comply with it? Well, there are a couple of reasons why refugee law continues to be of really significant value. And the first is the role that it plays for courts. So courts provide a check and balance against the worst acts of nation states. They provide a means that when politicians acting out of majoritarian or populist instinct do something to violate refugee rights, advocates can go to courts and say, no, the actions of this state violate international refugee law or violate the ways in which refugee law has been incorporated in municipal or national law at the domestic level. And we see examples of where courts have blocked the worst behavior of states by using refugee law. So for instance, in my own country's case, the UK, they've recently done a deal with Rwanda to send refugees to Rwanda. And the courts have stopped that act. Both the national courts in the UK, but also the European Court of Human Rights has said, no, this is a violation of law, refugee law and human rights law, you can't do it. And so no planes have left the UK taking refugees to Rwanda at the current time. We can also see examples where, for instance, even in the US, under Donald Trump, some of the worst policies and executive orders of the administration were blocked and stopped by the Supreme Court. So it was the courts that act as a brake on the worst excesses of populist government. And we see examples of strategic litigation, for instance, in other parts of the world. So in countries like Kenya, advocacy organizations routinely use strategic litigation to hold the government to account for violations of its own legal framework in the crackdown on refugee rights. The second way in which international refugee law continues to be important is for advocacy. It provides a really important tool where advocates on behalf of refugee rights can say, don't do this just because we say you should do it because governments have signed up to this. There's an agreement, an internationally recognized agreement that has the character of law of being binding in terms of rules that states have to respect. And it creates a common language, a shared language that advocates, that NGOs, civil society organizations can hold up and hold states accountable for. So in spite of the limitations, courts and the judiciary are really important mechanisms, and law works effectively to support and strengthen the work of advocacy.
Thank you very much, Alex, for this answer. I think, I mean, from what you said, the importance of international law, international refugee law in this, and how we should really understand it well. But just to make a transformation to the next question, because I think you brushed upon it a bit, but I would like to expand a little here. So building on from what you just said, how can we specifically, as refugee advocates, use the international refugee law as a tool for the advocacy, especially in the context of Geneva? So how can we, is it important? Do we need to understand? I mean, you mentioned in your answer from the first question that it is important for us as advocates to understand and hold states accountable for something that they sign. But just to expand a little on it, how can we as advocates really use the international, have a leverage of this law in our advocacy work?
So international refugee law plays different functions, say in a multilateral context like Geneva, compared to in, say, a national context. But if we start with that, say, Geneva environment, Geneva is a sort of place for the United Nations multilateral fora that relate to refugee rights and humanitarian affairs. It's where UNHCR headquarters are based. It's where the UNHCR Executive Committee meets. And if it's often where meetings like the Global Refugee Forum take place. It's also important to recognize that the UN human rights system is primarily based there, and human rights law is also relevant for refugee rights advocacy. I think refugee law provides a common language a language that states can recognize because they've signed up to, because these agreements are agreements that states have created on their own terms. And so that common language is important because it can mean that across countries, across regions, around the world, advocacy movements can coalesce around common positions in a language that is clearly understandable by states and the multilateral system. So I think we shouldn't underestimate how important that common language is within the UN system, across states, across civil society and NGOs. So when in Geneva, UNHCR has its regular NGO consultations, that legal framework provides a language where NGOs and civil society organizations can, for instance, agree on common statements. And very often those common statements are speaking to concerns about the actions of UNHCR, holding UNHCR accountable, but also holding states accountable. And they can forge those collective statements that they make at UNHCR's NGO consultations, that they put forward to UNHCR's executive committee in the language of refugee law that gives it more strength, more credibility. And there have been historical examples of civil society-led coalitions that have led to transformative effects in the refugee space. So for instance, a long-standing campaign against so-called refugee warehousing beginning in the early 2000s, pushing against protracted refugee situations, led to UNHCR executive committee resolutions agreed upon by nation-state members of the executive committee as actions to take forwards. There have been long-standing civil society-led coalitions around, for instance, the work rights of refugees and the socioeconomic rights of refugees, led by international NGOs, supported by local civil society organizations, that have also culminated in executive committee resolutions being passed by UNHCR's executive committee, by a real push on particular nation states to change their policies, to change their practices, to implement the right to work at a national level. So there's a mechanism there in the Geneva system through which rights-based advocacy linked to law can get into the UN system and shape the requirements on nation states. It's also worth noting that some of the biggest changes in law and practice relating to forced migration has come about through civil society work in Geneva that uses refugee law. So around internal displacement, for instance, the so-called guiding principles on internal displacement that emerged in the late 1990s were initially driven by civil society actors, drawing upon refugee law, human rights law, and humanitarian law to say these are the principles from hard law that should apply to this emerging challenge. Can we work with nation states to consolidate that in soft law, in a set of guiding principles? And over time, those have influenced the behavior and practice of states. So in Geneva, there's a series of mechanisms through which law plays that role, leading from advocacy to new instruments that can influence law and practice at a national level. At a national level, it's quite different. So you can do different things with law in a country context. You can engage in strategic litigation. If a country is violating international refugee law or national law on work rights, on the freedom of movement of refugees, on the right to asylum, on aspects of refugee status determination, it's possible to work with particular legal NGOs or rights advocacy organizations to bring a case to national court, to set precedent and lead to jurisprudence that can change that government's behavior and practice at the level of implementation. And that takes place everywhere from Kenya to Thailand to across Europe, North America and Australia, that strategic litigation can be effective in changing practice. So law is not just something abstract, it's a practical tool through which NGOs and civil society organizations can agree on principles and drive those principles into action.
Thank you very much, Alex. I think it's extremely important for a lot of our participants, especially those who don't have maybe a legal background, to really see that law is very important process, also understanding it here. I really appreciate the examples you've given there on the Geneva level, especially those life examples, how civil society made a change. The guiding principle on internal displacement is a very important tool, and having it as an example here also motivates us to see that a change could be done. Also on the national level, how litigation processes and court processes could actually change some of the laws or practices there is highly appreciated also to see how it's been done. Which leads me to the next question. I think there are maybe very few people in the world that could answer this question based on their experience, and you're definitely one of them. So despite the laws that we have, we keep hearing about the Geneva Convention. Is it outdated? Is it not outdated? The international refugee law, is it outdated? Do we need a change? If we have so many gaps, should there be a development of more international refugee law, more tools, the convention itself? What do you think?
There are significant gaps in international refugee law, and there are significant limitations on what it can do. The 1951 Convention was a product of its time. It was created in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was adapted for the early Cold War period, and it was focused very much on Europe. And then it was only through the 1967 protocol that it formally expanded to the rest of the world. But it was a very, if you like, Eurocentric creation, a product of history, a product of its geography. And although its negotiators recognized that it would adapt over time, that it would be reinterpreted for new circumstances and potentially expanded to other geographical regions beyond Europe, it nevertheless reflects the context in which it was created, and it adapts relatively slowly to new circumstances and different challenges around the world. So for example, let's take a few of the gaps that exist. One area of gap is the people to whom the convention applies. It defines refugees as people who are outside their country of nationality because of a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership of a social group, or political opinion. And that idea of persecution was originally focused on the idea of a persecuting actor, a state out to get an individual because of who they are, because of their identity. Now, over time, that's been reinterpreted to include, for instance, people fleeing war or generalized violence, people fleeing non-state armed actors, as well as governments. But there are whole areas where many new drivers of displacement are systematically excluded from that definition. So we can think, for instance, about climate change and environmental displacement. The World Bank estimates that by 2050, some 200 million people could be displaced by climate change, most internally, but significant and increasing numbers across borders. Now, at the moment, they're not captured by that 1951 Convention definition. And practice around human rights law is moving very slowly in that area. So there's a gap around climate change displacement. There are also gaps in other areas of displacement. So when we think about fragile states, many people fleeing today are not fleeing individualized persecution. They're fleeing chronically weak states in terms of governance structures that are unable to meet the most fundamental rights of their own citizens, sometimes because of food insecurity, water insecurity, gang violence, the absence of the rule of law, serious disturbances to public order. All of those contexts mean that different states are interpreting the application of the convention to their circumstances differently. If we look at Europe, for instance, when Europe receives people from countries like Eritrea or Somalia or Iraq or Afghanistan, one country might have a much higher recognition rate under the convention than another. And those inconsistencies stem from the difficulty of shoehorning present-day drivers of displacement into a definition agreed upon in the early 1950s. So we get these inconsistencies. So there's a need to update in terms of who is forcibly displaced, who is a refugee, and how we define a human rights-based entitlement to migrate across international borders. But the world is struggling to update in terms of who is a refugee. A second area where there's a big gap is around responsibility sharing. So the refugee system has quite strong norms around what might be called asylum. The obligation states have towards refugees who are on their own territory, who reach the territory of that country, asylum. But it has relatively weak norms around what might be called responsibility sharing, the obligation that countries have towards refugees who are on the territory of another state. And responsibility sharing can be delivered through resettlement places or through humanitarian and development aid. But at the moment, rich countries' contributions to resettlement and humanitarian and development aid to support the low and middle income countries that host most of the world's refugees are discretionary. There's no obligation or no clearly defined obligation under international law for rich countries to support low and middle income host countries. And that creates a horrible imbalance where in the refugee system, it's countries like Jordan, Lebanon, Pakistan, Iran, Kenya, Uganda, Thailand, Bangladesh, that host a huge proportion of the world's refugees. So up until the Ukraine crisis, UNHCR estimated that some 85% of the world's refugees were hosted in low and middle income countries around the world. And it's the rich countries, Europe, Australasia, North America, that are away from those crisis regions usually, that can step back and say, well, we'll contribute a little bit, but not very much. Now, in 2018, UNHCR unveiled something called the Global Compact on Refugees. And it was a pact that tried to support more predictable responsibility sharing, but it's non-binding. It still means that even though the compact creates things like solidarity platforms, where new conferences, new initiatives can be convened to try and encourage rich countries and resettlement countries to contribute more, they are discretionary. There is an ongoing gap in refugee law around responsibility sharing. So I think the two biggest gaps in the system are around new drivers of displacement and who is a refugee in that context, and secondly, responsibility sharing. But it's also worth saying we've got gaps in coverage for the existing refugee legal framework. Many regions of the world are not signatories to the 1951 Convention. South Asia, Southeast Asia, large parts of the Middle East have not signed the 1951 Convention. And so law has limited influence in those regions. It's also, as we've said, a massive gap that there is now fairly endemic non-compliance with the requirements of refugee law, even in signatory regions. So refugee law is struggling, but I would describe it as inadequate but indispensable. It would be very difficult to renegotiate the 1951 Convention today. The politics of asylum around the world is not an auspicious context to renegotiate refugee law. It would be very difficult today to get a deal as good as we got in the early 1950s. The political context is a real challenge. I think, though, over time, we will need to supplement refugee law, but it will have to come quite gradually. It will have to come through soft law agreements, like we saw on internal displacement with the guiding principles on internal displacement in the 1990s. And I can imagine something like that emerging for other people displaced by, for instance, climate change or fragile states, where there are gaps in coverage. And over time, as more and more people are displaced by these new circumstances, governments will realize that they're better off cooperating on a new agreement in those areas than struggling to address the challenge as individual countries. I also think, though, it's very important to say that law by itself is not an adequate solution. A lot of what drives the behavior of states towards refugees and displaced people is not simply law, it is politics. And so for refugee advocates and rights advocates and organizations like UNHCR, we have to also understand and engage with the political realities. Law influences states to a certain extent under certain conditions, but politics drives a lot of what happens to refugees. It shapes the policies and the compliance and non-compliance of countries with refugee law. And we have to understand the power relations, the interests, the ideas that shape what states do. And it's only by developing the capacity to influence that politics that we can make a difference in a context in which law is weak. So I think, for instance, the UN Refugee Agency, which has a lot of lawyers working very hard to ensure state compliance with law, needs perhaps more capacity to do political analysis and political engagement. I think for all of those of us who want to advance a refugee rights agenda, we have to do so in a context where we understand the domestic and international circumstances of the politics behind this and find avenues and mechanisms to influence and shape this. Law matters, it's very important, but so too does politics.
Thank you very much, Alex. Absolutely agree. Just to summarize what you just mentioned, and I think it's extremely important how you also led towards the politics part. You pointed out the gaps that we have in international refugee law, and I could summarize them to be it's about responsibility sharing. It's about the definition itself with the new factors and the circumstances. We see what's happening, for instance, in some countries. I've seen recently a case study from New Zealand about some refugees from Kiribati that they left the discussion open, for instance, for including the Geneva Convention to refugees leaving as part of the environmental collapse in Kiribati, for instance. But we also see the what you mentioned, the discretionary assistance of countries that they are not obligated to do, but they still do. But I think the transformation that's really important here about politics that is as equal or as important in this work, and especially in the advocacy, is extremely extremely or equally important to the international refugee law. And I think this is where our participants, the advocates, have to strike a balance to understanding refugee law and working on the politics, and also understanding the politics are key here. Alexander Betts, I really thank you very much for honoring us with your interview today and giving us a great time and information. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the great questions. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Have a nice day.